So first I want to start out with who are the Taino? And the most general description is by Irving Rouse, who is the doyen of Caribbean prehistory. And he states that the Taino is the ethnic group that inhabited the Bahamian archipelago, most of the Greater Antilles, and the northern part of the Lesser Antilles. I have added prior to, during the time of Columbus. We use the term Taino very loosely, but in fact, the Taino is only the contact people. They are actually a product of thousands of years of migrations from Central and South America. And then what we know as a Taino came about 1200 CE or AD. And we know that Columbus did not discover the Americas. The Americas was already home to millions of people who resided there from thousands of years of migration. There have been so many waves of migration into the region, especially the Caribbean. Columbus's journey marked the beginning of centuries of exploration and colonization of North, Central, South America, and the Caribbean. It resulted in one of the most horrific events in history, and that is the Great Dying. That's what some scholars refer to it. There are estimations between 50 to 90% demise in population. 50% is the lowest estimation, and 90%, some people say as much as 95. Last year, Koch and his team, they estimated at 56 million people, about 10% of the global population that died, and they believe that it even impacted climate change and resulted in a small ice age and vast cooling over the 3 centuries after. In the 19th century, in Puerto Rico especially, we see the evolution of what became known as the Taino revival movement, or indigenous or neo-Taino movement. And it started as a grassroots movement, and it has evolved to become a nationalistic and cultural identity. And it really picked up speed in the 1970s, and it continues to this day. And it has become especially popular in other Spanish-speaking territories, such as Dominican Republic and in Cuba, and especially amongst their diaspora in the United States. It's interesting, it is seen as a declaration of the survival of the Mestizo, which is genetic and cultural mixing, but it is essentially a rejection of Latino identity. You know, the term Latin America is a very problematic and controversial phrase and term. But to some extent, it's also a rejection of Black identity, because if you're not white, then you are colored. And it is a regaining of indigenous traditions and culture. The fundamental objectives is it seeks to challenge colonial legacies. It seeks to rebuke the myth of extinction. One of the things that has not been properly circulated is the fact that not all the indigenous groups died out. A number of them set up independent settlements in the interior, such as the Blue Mountains, such as the Dry Harbor Mountains, and they survived. And we believe that the first maroon, actually Taino, because maroonage is not based on race, maroonage is a lifestyle. So we have no idea how many people who have survived, but the fact that a lot of the Taino traditions still survive suggests that there was some medium of exchange, and we think the Africans played a very important part in indigenous survival, particularly what became known as the Maroons. The first Africans arrived in 1513 in Jamaica, and then of course, between the war between the Spanish and the British, a lot of the enslaved Africans were freed, and some escaped. Some joined forces with either side, and ultimately that is, in a nutshell, how the Jamaican Maroons began. But the Maroons believe that the Tainos are their ancestors, and they believe that they're descendants, and that the Tainos are deemed as the first freedom fighters.
Of course, we were traditionally taught that the indigenous populations in the Caribbean, especially in the South, were migrating northward from the continent. But more recent research on DNA investigation has proven that they were coming from multiple directions, and that kind of myth that we work with has been completely debunked. But it does start the conversation of these islands or the ocean, kind of, it's a place of people on the move. When we talk about migration, we normally talk only about migrating north, Canada, the US, and so on, which brings up an interesting question about the diaspora, about where the Caribbean begins and ends as a borderless concept. But it also starts to talk about this constant flux of people, right? But even though there may be different language categories and different ethnicities, there's something really interesting that I began to think about, especially starting from people like J.J. Thomas and Sylvester, which is the kind of movement. In other words, it's kind of remarkable that people sort of entered here as property, then became subjects of the crown, and are kind of sitting at that juncture of becoming citizens of a potential republic, right? And that's a massive shift of sort of cognizance of both in terms of its political realities, how you negotiate with a space. It's a very complicated thing. So there's migration between the islands, as well as there's migration into the wider diasporic thing. Transience, movement is something inherent in the Caribbean way. It kind of talks about a kind of critique or a way of seeing, and that may be something that binds us because of a common history in which we were enlisted to, in a sense, our labors, our very being was always for the betterment of somebody else and not necessarily ourselves.
I am particularly interested in how this notion, though, of the identities that are perceived in the diaspora and the identities that are supposedly created within the Caribbean have a lot to do with specific histories. Chris spoke about a common history, but there are also individual common histories. And I think that the discussion of Francophone Caribbean and their process in terms of identity, of looking for a particular identity, has very much to do with the fact that they are departments of France. And in our entire discussion of the creation of identities, I think we have to look specifically at those histories, those individual histories.
So I am a child of migration, but 3 layers of migration. My family is from a rural area in Haiti, and then they migrated to the city, and then we migrated to New York. I mention these 3 layers because in Haiti, there is an internal migration itself. Like, for example, my father's, who was born in Beauséjour, our ancestral village in the mountains, his birth certificate said that he was paysan. And my mother, who was born in the city, her family was citoyen, like she was a citizen. So it's interesting to come out of that. And even the rural area is Mouna de Yo, the outside country, people from the outside country, and people in the city, or I guess counter the inside country. So this, I think, is in part some of our, especially younger generation of people figuring out, and part of some of our difficulty in this sort of the cleaving apart of our country is that we define ourselves in many ways as 2 different countries, Mouna de Yo, Mouna de Dan. Migration today for us is, of course, extraordinarily complicated, because if you're Haitian, especially in the Caribbean, you get the reaction, people experience us often as people who come by boat, they experience us a certain way, and there's a view of Haitian migration that here in the Dominican Republic, is not often welcomed, but that people see as having, as the only choice out. And recently we've had newer migrations to Brazil, to Chile, which has led to this circle of people moving now, walking often by foot from Brazil and Chile to the US border to try to come here. People who have family here, who are trying to rejoin family here. What is migration now for our people and other people? We're in a week where this administration, the Biden administration, has been counter to promises deporting people back to Haiti. And they've actually, deportations have increased because the Trump administration left in place some rules called Title 72, where people can be deported because they could be suspected of having COVID, which is ironic because they're being deported to places with fewer cases of COVID than here. So migration is these deportations. Migration is Paul Perilus, who a Haitian man, who was born in St. Martin of Haitian parents, even naming him is hard, who was recently deported to Haiti and has never been because he didn't have the St. Martin citizenship. Migration is certainly climate. And it's amazing that we started with the presentation with the Tainos because they gave us that word hurricane, which is hurricane, which makes us so vulnerable to, I think, massive future migration, because climate migration is going to be one of the most urgent migrations to come.
Caribbean culture, I mean, it's not a recent phenomenon. It's hundreds years of interactions. I mean, social memory is such an important part of who we are today. And culture is not static. It's fluid just like the sea that connects us. It's somebody was mentioning about Belize and Guyana. They are part of the Caribbean. Every area that touches the Caribbean Sea is considered Caribbean, but some territories choose not to embrace themselves as a part of the Caribbean. Identity is something that is instilled. I mean, our construction of what is Caribbean, our construction of what it means to be Jamaican, these are carefully planned ideals, but at the same time, it's a personal choice.
Something that I think we want to also think about is the interconnectivity that is created now, and our young people, how do they perceive migration and Caribbeanness? Because many of them already see themselves as transnational and do not identify with a nationalism, or even, as Chris alluded to, the post-independence nationalism. But many of them have even moved from the spaces of the people in the 80s and the 90s who may be trying to open up and broaden their definitions of their Caribbeanness. Many of them see themselves as very transnational. And we have to also look at that when we think about this notion of Caribbean identity.
Just briefly, I think that there is a togetherness that is happening now as we, from many different places and backgrounds, share a kind of common desire to put the pieces that we have back together historically and ethnically, racially, and that we're trying to find meaning by piecing things together in a very particular way that I think, to me, is very Caribbean and not quite like other places who are also piecing things together. So I find that quite moving, and there's a specific kind of complexity of ingredients that, because I'm a part of it, obviously I'm very moved by it. But even in this discussion, I think there is a common goal of trying to put things together in a very particular way that I love.